Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling liberty. Specifically, you sent over some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on positive and negative liberty. So let's try to unpack those. It's one of those concepts that, you hear all the time and you think you have a pretty good grasp of it. But then when you actually kind of sit down and try to define it, it gets kind of tricky.
It really does. It's deceptively simple.
Yeah.
You think, liberty, freedom. Oh, yeah, I know what that is. And then you start to think, well, what does that actually mean? And it gets real complicated real fast.
Yeah, and so the Stanford Encyclopedia starts off with a classic example.
Yeah.
Driving a car. So imagine you're driving down the road, you get to a fork of the road, you turn left. No one's forcing you to turn left. You could have just as easily turned right.
Right.
That's negative liberty. It's the absence of obstacles that would prevent you from doing something that you want to do.
Yeah. No one's put up a wall. No one's saying you can't go that way. The path is open.
Now, let's say you get to another intersection and you turn right. Again, no one's stopping you. But what if the reason you turned right is because you have an overwhelming craving for a cigarette
Right.
and there's a store right there?
Oh.
And so you're drawn to it.
So now we're getting into the realm of positive liberty.
Mhm.
You were physically free to go straight ahead,
Right.
but something internal to you, some desire, or in this case, maybe even an addiction,
Yeah.
is compelling you to go right. So the question is, are you actually free in that instance, or is something else controlling your actions?
Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting about this debate, especially from, someone coming from a philosophical background.
Mm-hmm.
It really gets to the heart of what does it mean to be free? Is it just the absence of barriers? Or does it also require some level of internal control or self-mastery?
Yeah, self-determination is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this tension really gets to the heart of the distinction that Isaiah Berlin famously made between negative and positive liberty.
Right.
And he really framed the central questions. He said, with negative liberty, the question is, what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be without interference by other persons?
Okay.
Whereas with positive liberty, he frames it as what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that.
And it's not just that there are two kinds of liberty. Berlin was saying that these are potentially rival interpretations of the same ideal.
Totally.
And that has huge implications for how we think about, individual rights, the role of the state, how we structure a just society. All of that stuff flows from how we understand this very basic concept of freedom.
And this is where things get really interesting, and especially, I think, for someone coming from a philosophical background like yourself, where you really start to question, okay, well, if freedom is really about positive liberty, as you were saying, this idea of self-mastery or self-determination, then doesn't that potentially give a lot of power to, let's say, the state or other authorities to sort of step in and say, well, we know what's best for you. We know what your higher self would want, even if you don't realize it yet.
Right. Isn't that like the classic argument for a totalitarian state or some kind of benevolent dictator who's like, no, we're just forcing you to be free?
Yeah, it sounds very Orwellian, doesn't it? We're just helping you be free,
Yeah.
even if it means limiting your choices or actions.
Right.
And that was Berlin's big concern. He saw that the idea of positive liberty, while appealing in some ways, has this dark side to it. And historically, a lot of really bad things have been done in the name of forcing people to be truly free.
So then how would someone who favors negative liberty respond to that? Would they say that,
Yeah.
a slave who's happy with their situation is free because
Mhm.
they're getting what they want?
Yeah.
That can't be right.
That's a really good point. And this is where negative liberty proponents would say, no, it's not about whether you actually want something. It's about whether you're prevented from wanting it or from pursuing it. So you could have a contented slave who's got all their needs met, but if they never had the option to choose otherwise, if that door was always closed to them, then they're not truly free from a negative liberty perspective.
It's the potential. Right. Like the open door, even if you don't walk through it.
Right. It's the possibility of choosing otherwise. That's what matters.
And this connects to, a lot of thinkers in the liberal tradition like Humboldt and Mill,
Yes.
who would say that you can't force a plant to grow a certain way.
Absolutely. You need to give it the right conditions, space to flourish, the absence of restrictions so it can kind of organically develop in its own way. The same principle should apply to human beings. You can't force someone to be free. You can't force them to develop in a certain way. They need that open space to explore, to experiment, to make their own choices, even if those choices are mistakes. That's part of the process of becoming a fully developed individual.
I mean, isn't there a middle ground, though? Like, can we conceive of some form of positive liberty that kind of avoids these pitfalls, that doesn't veer into that kind of, authoritarian territory? Like, there's a difference between forcing beliefs onto people and, let's say, creating conditions where they can make more informed choices, right?
That's a really insightful point, and I think that gets to the idea of content-neutral positive liberty. So instead of focusing on what people should desire, it focuses on how those desires are formed. Are they the product of manipulation, or are they the product of, rational deliberation and genuine consideration of different options?
So it's not about dictating the outcome. It's about ensuring the process is fair, so to speak.
Exactly. Like, if you think about the classic example of a Muslim woman who chooses to wear a headscarf, is she genuinely free if that choice was the result of, pressure or indoctrination, even if it aligns with her current desires? Content-neutral positive liberty would say no, true freedom requires genuine informed choice, regardless of the content of that choice.
So this brings up the role of the state, right? Like, could a state actually promote this kind of positive liberty without infringing on negative liberty? Like, think about education. Could we say that, providing a robust public education system that teaches critical thinking skills and exposes people to a wide range of perspectives is a way of promoting positive liberty without dictating what those people should believe?
I think that's a really compelling idea, and it suggests that the state can play a role in empowering individuals to make more autonomous choices without actually dictating the content of those choices. But even that, I think, is not without its challenges.
I'm sensing a but coming.
Well, I mean, even content-neutral measures can potentially clash with certain liberal values. Like, who gets to decide what constitutes rational deliberation? And doesn't even the most well-intentioned public enlightenment campaign risk subtly promoting certain values over others?
It seems like we're always navigating this like this tightrope, right, between individual autonomy and societal influence. And even when we're trying to promote positive liberty, there's always the potential for it to backfire or to have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It highlights the complexity of this debate and reminds us that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions. But before we get too deep into those complexities, there's another alternative I think we should bring in, and that's the idea of Republican liberty. This offers a slightly different way of thinking about freedom altogether.
Oh, intrigue me. Tell me more about this Republican liberty. How does it differ from both negative and positive?
So, Republican liberty shifts the focus from just non-interference to non-domination. It argues that even if someone isn't actively prevented from doing something, they can still be unfree if they're subject to the arbitrary will of another.
So it's not just about having choices. It's about those choices being genuinely yours, not made under duress or under someone else's thumb.
Precisely. Like, imagine a husband who never actually restricts his wife's choices. But if their society gives him this inherent power over her, then she's still living under his domination, even if he never actively wields that power.
So it's about the potential for arbitrary power, even if it's never exercised. It's about ensuring that individuals have a space where they're not at the mercy of someone else's whims, even if that someone else is benevolent.
Right. And that raises a really interesting question. Is Republican liberty actually distinct from negative liberty? Or is it just a more nuanced, more refined version of it? That's a debate philosophers are still having.
Ooh, I sense a future deep dive coming on. But for now, let's not get too sidetracked. We need to bring in another big player here who tries to make sense of this whole conceptual jungle. And that's Gerald McCallum, who argues that maybe there's just one basic concept of freedom after all.
McCallum's approach, I think, is so refreshing because he cuts through the whole positive versus negative dichotomy and gives us this framework for understanding how these seemingly very different views of freedom might actually be variations on a single theme.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me how McCallum manages to unify all this.
So he argues that freedom is best understood as this triadic relationship involving three key elements: the agent, the constraints, and the purposes. And his point is that everyone, whether they're on team positive liberty or team negative liberty, they're all working within this framework. They're just interpreting those elements differently.
So we're all playing the same game, but with slightly different rule books.
Exactly. Like, who is the agent? Is it the individual's empirical self with all their, quirks and desires? Or is it some idealized true self? What counts as a constraint? Is it just external barriers? Or can it also be internal factors like, fear or ignorance? And then what are the purposes we're talking about? Any old desire, or only those that are deemed rational or authentic?
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack. So is he saying that all interpretations are equally valid? That there's
Yeah.
no right or wrong answer here?
Not necessarily. His framework is more about clarifying the terms of the debate. It helps us pinpoint where the real disagreements lie. By breaking freedom down into these three components, we can analyze different conceptions of freedom more rigorously. We can see where those underlying assumptions diverge and ultimately have a more productive conversation about what we truly value in freedom.
That makes sense. And I bet you can connect this back to our trusty core analogy, right?
Of course. The beauty of McCallum's framework is that it allows us to see how even a simple scenario, like driving to the store, can be described as both free and unfree, depending on how you define those three key elements:
Yeah.
the agent, the constraints, and the purposes.
Okay, let's take that philosophical road trip. Walk me through how McCallum's thinking applies to our driver.
Let's go back to our smoker heading to the cigarette store. If we define the agent as just the person's empirical self, driven by that immediate craving for nicotine, and if we only focus on external constraints like traffic laws, then yeah, they're free to drive to the store. No one's physically stopping them. But
But
Right.
if we shift the focus and we say, okay, well, maybe the agent is their higher self, the part of them that values long-term health and maybe regrets the addiction,
Right.
then the picture changes, doesn't it? Then you could argue that they're unfree because their actions are being dictated by this internal constraint, this powerful craving.
Precisely. And depending on how we define purpose, we could say they're free to satisfy their immediate desire, but unfree to pursue their long-term well-being. McCallum's framework allows us to see how the same situation can yield different conclusions about freedom depending on what lens we're using.
It really highlights how our understanding of freedom is shaped by these underlying assumptions that we have about human nature, about the nature of constraints, and about, what goals we consider worthy of pursuing. And this makes me wonder, is this lack of clarity the reason why debates about freedom get so heated so often? Are we just talking past each other, using the same word but loading it with totally different meanings?
It's definitely possible. And it underscores why conceptual clarity is so important in these discussions. If we want to have a meaningful debate about freedom, we need to be precise about what we're talking about. We need to be upfront about our assumptions about the agent, the constraints, and the purposes. Only then can we really have a productive conversation about how to best achieve freedom, whatever form of freedom we prioritize.
So it's not just about freedom. It's about freedom of what, for whom, and under what conditions.
Exactly. And those are questions that we'll continue to grapple with.
I mean, it seems like, this whole positive liberty idea can be especially tricky when you're talking about groups of people, right? Like, what happens when you have a permanent oppressed minority in a democracy? The majority could theoretically say, we know what's best for you, and try to, uplift this minority according to their values. But is that really freedom?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, and I think it gets at the heart of why this whole concept of freedom is so contested. Because in that kind of scenario, you could have the majority imposing their will on the minority in the name of positive liberty, like, we're going to assimilate you into the dominant culture because that's what's truly best for you. Or you could have policies that are supposedly designed to help this minority group, but they don't actually take into account the group's own desires or their ways of life.
Right. It's like that whole we know what's best for you kind of paternalism.
Exactly. And so it becomes this really tricky balancing act between trying to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to flourish, to reach their full potential, but also respecting the right of individuals and groups to determine their own path, even if that path might not align with what the majority considers good or right.
It seems like finding that balance between promoting positive liberty and avoiding coercion is a constant struggle, especially when you have these diverse populations with different values and aspirations.
Absolutely. And I think that's why this whole idea of open dialogue and empathy and a willingness to really listen to and understand different perspectives is so crucial, especially when we're talking about policies that are aimed at enhancing freedom.
This makes me think about that whole measuring freedom idea we touched on earlier. Like, if freedom is so multifaceted and context dependent, can we even quantify it?
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with these really complex social dynamics.
That's a question that has sparked a lot of debate among philosophers. It's definitely a challenging endeavor, but it's not entirely impossible. And I think going back to McCallum's triadic formula can give us some clues.
Right. The agent, the constraints, and the purposes. So are we talking about measuring how many options an agent has given certain constraints and how well those options align with their purposes. Is that the idea?
Yeah, you're on the right track. A lot of attempts to measure freedom focus on this idea of an option set. So basically, the bigger and more diverse the range of choices someone has available to them, the greater their freedom, at least in a negative sense.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
But how do you actually count those options? Like, are all choices created equal? Is choosing between 50 brands of cereal the same as choosing your career path or where you want to live?
That's a huge sticking point. And some philosophers would say, no, we need to weigh different options based on how important they are, maybe even factoring in how much the agent values them. But then, of course, that gets into some pretty subjective territory.
It does. And wouldn't that risk blurring the lines between negative and positive liberty? If we start saying that freedom is greater when you have more valuable options, aren't we implying that some choices are objectively better than others?
Exactly. And that's a key point of contention in this whole measuring freedom debate. Some theorists, especially those who favor a more robust understanding of positive liberty, would say those kinds of value judgments are unavoidable. But others, especially those in the pure negative liberty camp, would insist that any attempt to measure freedom has to be value neutral. You just focus on the quantity and diversity of options, not their perceived worth.
So no ranking cereal brands based on their contribution to self-actualization then.
Uh-huh, exactly. For the strict negative liberty folks, it's all about that formal freedom, the absence of constraints, regardless of where those options might lead or how the agent feels about them.
Okay, I see the distinction. But even if we stick to that purely quantitative approach, wouldn't we still run into problems? Like, how do you compare different kinds of constraints? Is being physically barred from doing something the same as being threatened with punishment if you do it? Those seem qualitatively different, don't they?
Absolutely. That's another hurdle in this whole quest to measure freedom. And some theorists have proposed incorporating things like the probability of a constraint being enforced. So, like, a law that's rarely enforced might restrict your freedom less than a social norm that carries a high risk of ostracism, even though neither one is physically preventing you from doing something.
It seems like we're trying to capture this incredibly nuanced, complex thing with numbers and formulas. Does that even do justice to the concept of freedom? Like, wouldn't we inevitably miss those subtle qualitative aspects that make freedom such a rich and contested concept?
That's a valid concern. And a lot of philosophers would argue that any attempt to measure overall freedom is going to oversimplify things. It's probably impossible to create one single metric that captures all the nuances of what it means to be free.
But even if we can't come up with a perfect formula, isn't there some value in trying to quantify freedom? Like, if we want to compare different societies or different political systems, wouldn't it be helpful to have at least a rough measure of how much freedom they offer their citizens?
For sure, even if it's imperfect, having some way to quantify freedom can be really valuable. It allows us to make comparisons, track changes over time, and hold governments accountable to their promises of liberty. Imagine trying to assess whether a new policy enhances or diminishes freedom without any way to gauge its impact. It would be like trying to navigate without a compass.
And maybe even more importantly, the very act of trying to measure freedom forces us to be explicit about what we mean by it. It makes us confront those different interpretations, acknowledge the trade-offs that inevitably come up when we're trying to balance individual rights with the collective good, and think about how those trade-offs might play out differently in different social contexts.
Exactly. So even though we might never find the perfect freedom meter, the process of trying to create one can be incredibly illuminating. It can deepen our understanding of this really essential value and encourage us to think critically about how we structure our societies to best foster genuine human flourishing.
So much food for thought. And speaking of food for thought, I think it's time for us to take a little mental snack break. We've covered a lot of ground already, from driving analogies to triadic formulas to the challenges of measuring freedom. We've really delved into the nitty-gritty of this whole liberty landscape.
We have, and I think our listeners could probably use a moment to digest all these rich philosophical concepts before we move on.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the theory of freedom, but let's get down to brass tacks. How do these different ideas of liberty actually play out in the real world?
Well, let's take education, for example. From a purely negative liberty perspective, freedom in education would mean letting parents choose where to send their kids to school, public, private, homeschooling. The focus would be on minimizing government interference in those choices.
So basically like a free market of educational options.
Exactly. But someone who's more into positive liberty might say, hold on a second. True freedom in education means not just having choices, but actually having the resources and capabilities to make those choices meaningful. So, this might involve things like ensuring that schools are equitably funded, or providing extra support for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, or offering a wider range of curricula to meet different needs and aspirations.
So it's not just about having options. It's about making sure those options are actually accessible to everyone.
Right. And then you have the Republican liberty view, which might focus more on making sure that the educational system isn't dominated by any particular group or ideology. So this could involve things like promoting diversity in the curriculum, or making sure that schools are democratically governed, or protecting academic freedom.
It's like each of these perspectives is highlighting a different aspect of what it means to have freedom in education. And they all kind of contribute to a richer understanding of the concept.
I totally agree. I think they can actually complement each other. It's not about picking one and ignoring the others. It's about seeing how they all fit together and how they can inform each other.
This makes me think about how these principles could apply to other areas too, like healthcare or the workplace. Could you use these same lenses, negative, positive, Republican, to analyze freedom in those contexts as well?
Absolutely. Like healthcare, a negative liberty view might emphasize freedom of choice when it comes to doctors and treatments and insurance plans, less government involvement. A positive liberty person might focus more on making sure everyone has access to quality healthcare regardless of income or social status. And someone coming from a Republican liberty perspective might really zero in on patient autonomy and informed consent, making sure that people aren't being subjected to the arbitrary power of, say, medical institutions or insurance companies.
It's really interesting to see how these frameworks can be applied to so many different issues. It's like you're giving people a set of tools to analyze these complex social problems and to think about different ways of promoting freedom in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, and that's why I think engaging with political philosophy is so important. It gives us the language and the frameworks to have these really important conversations about what a just society looks like and how we can actually achieve it. It pushes us to move beyond those simplistic slogans and really grapple with the messiness of balancing individual rights with the common good.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've really explored this whole world of liberty, from negative to positive to Republican freedom. We've even talked about whether we can truly measure something as slippery as freedom.
And hopefully, we've inspired them to keep asking questions about it, to keep exploring these ideas and engaging in this ongoing conversation about what it means to be free in a complex world.
Absolutely. Because as we've seen, freedom isn't just a one-size-fits-all concept. It's something that we have to constantly think about, debate, and strive for, both individually and as a society. So keep those philosophical gears turning, everyone. And until next time, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.